Just a brief recap, we talked about why we're doing what we're doing, why are we looking at infant development, we talked about reflexes, we talked about sleep, we talked about crying. Neonatal behavioral assessment scale, how do we know if a newborn is healthy? How do infants learn is what we did in the last lecture. So we talked about these 4 different ways of learning. We talked about classical conditioning. We talked about operant conditioning. We talked about infants' preference for novel stimuli and how we use that in habituation paradigms. And we talked about imitation. Right. And this is where we left off. Sequence of motor development. And so motor development happens on 2 planes. One is gross motor development. The other is fine motor development. Gross motor development is about the long muscles. And it actually coordinates big movements. So it's things like crawling, standing, walking are in the domain of gross motor development. And reaching, grasping, all those coordinating the muscles of the fingers and the hands are fine motor development. There are differences in rates of skills, so no 2 child might be alike, right? But what we should also know is that skills are interrelated. So it is probably more accurate to think that a baby who is able to coordinate, for example, its head, can hold its neck, will also free his arms, right? So if the baby can't do that, the arm movements are going to be a little bit more restricted and the baby is going to get less practice. So as they mature, seemingly unrelated motor developments are actually dependent on one another. And motor skill, for that reason, motor skills are thought of as dynamic systems, meaning the developments in one ability actually influences the development of the other, and there's a bidirectional relationship. And so there are 4 contributors to the acquisition of each new motor ability. Central nervous system development is, of course, one of the big players. Another one is body's movement capacity. What can the body do so that the baby, the infant, practices other kinds of motor abilities? Child's goals. What is the child trying to achieve? Is the child trying to manipulate something? Is the child trying to grab something? These goals come into play, and also environmental supports. How much support is there for this baby to learn this particular skill? And you might think that there isn't a lot of variance across cultures. Actually, there is. And we will talk about that a little bit too. So we can conceive of skills as being hardwired versus soft assembled. And here, if we think about hardwired skills, we might think that the environment doesn't really play that big of a role. Everything is basically pre-programmed in the infant, and it unfolds according to a maturational timetable. And if that were the case, then skills would be hardwired. Soft assembled skills, in contrast, are those that also include the environment and baby's efforts, meaning the outcome, what the baby can do, their ability will vary depending on how much environmental support there is and what the baby wants to do. And there seems to be quite a bit of evidence that support the soft assembled skill theory. In that, for example, we see that certain infants in certain parts of the world that are always, for example, carried in a sling, have their arms quite free. And in cultures where women wear a lot of bead necklaces and jewelry, those babies actually start grasping those a little bit earlier than your average infant that is in a Western culture that lays down in its bed or in its cot more often. So this is quite, for example, interesting. What you see here is an 8-week-old baby. This is a picture from your book. And we know that this baby will not accurately reach for a toy that is interesting. But if the baby, okay, this looks like it's cruel, but it isn't. The baby is comfortable. If the baby is basically tied to a board, right? Both arms and hands are free. The baby is going to reach with the feet and try to explore the toy. And so normally babies don't do this. Their arms are free and, but they're not very good at it. The thing is, the movements of the legs are more constricted than the arms. So coordinating the arms is a little bit harder than coordinating the leg in this situation. So the baby actually succeeds better if he had to use his legs. And obviously, there's a lot of plasticity too. We know that there are people with handicaps who also become masters at using different body parts to accomplish tasks that are usually or traditionally accomplished with different. There are people who can paint with their feet, right? Who can assemble stuff with their feet. So we can. So it's not like there's a maturational timetable and it just unfolds such that the environment puts some constraints on the child. The culture provides reinforcement. The baby has goals. They all come together and produce what we know as motor development. Now, we will start with reaching. So there are different steps in reaching and grasping. So this is a very nice example because when you think about it, reaching seems like such a simple thing to do, right? There's something in your visual field, you want to take it, then you will basically track it and grasp it. But what is involved in this very simple sequence of actions is that, for one thing, you are, without being aware, balancing your body, right? If you were unbalanced, you wouldn't be able to grasp. You probably are also coordinating both the visual input with the motor action so that you don't, if the thing is moving, let's say, you don't grasp where the object isn't, right? You have to guess appropriately, estimate where your hand needs to go appropriately. Another thing is that once you have actually made contact with the object, you will have to hold it. And in that case, according to what the object looks like, obviously, if it were a book, for example, the way I hold it will be different. You are going to prepare your hand in a different way in order to grasp that object. And babies learn these step by step. Newborns are pre-reachers. When they want to reach for something, they do the swiping motion. That is uncoordinated, really. It's in the direction of what they want to grasp, but they can't yet grasp it. After that, reaching becomes commonplace. And once reaching is established, we also start seeing different versions of grasps. The first is an ulnar grasp, which is very clumsy, and you guys all actually know babies doing this. It's just closing the four fingers around something. So it is not nuanced. It is just trapping something in one's, between the palms and the four fingers, right? Later on, once they are able to hold something in hand, they are going to be able to transfer it to the empty hand and back to explore it. Because they are not able to explore like you do. We're not going to do this right now. What is your name? Tuğçe. If we were to, for example, put a blindfold on Tuğçe and say we're going to give you some objects and we want you to tell us what they are, she probably will hold and feel the detail of the objects, right? And so since the babies aren't actually that dexterous with their fingers, they are moving things from one hand to the next to actually get more information about it. Pincer grasp comes later, where the baby starts, this is the basically pincer, being able to coordinate the index finger and the thumb to pick up smaller objects or to manipulate parts of objects. And you can see a nice pincer grasp there by 9 months. So I went over it, so whenever I spend time on a slide, make a note of it. This was a question on a previous first midterm. I don't know if it will be a question again, but this was a question. Okay, so motor development is integrated. Once infants master reaching and grasping, what happens? They pay more attention to the events that precede or follow their reaching and grasping actions. Because they spend so much time and effort trying to reach and grasp that their attention is more focused on the action of reaching and grasping. But once that becomes automatic, their attention is freed. And so they can then pay more attention to the events that follow their grasping in, or the events that happen before. Reaching and grasping also becomes more differentiating. They're no longer one action, but could also happen independently. And at this point, what happens? Watching adults and imitation with objects increase. I think this third bullet makes a lot of sense given what the first bullet says, right? Since they're able to pay more attention to the events, they also now have freed attention to learn. Okay. And there comes perceptual development. So we're going to start with tactile perception, which is touching, and then taste and smell, hearing. Hearing and speech perception, I'm going to spend more time on this in the language chapter 2. This is going to be a teaser. We won't go over everything, because I'm going to come back to these topics later. I think it's the 9th chapter. And then we're going to talk a little bit about vision. Why is it important to study infants' development of perceptual abilities? Why do we care? Well, we had asked the same questions with reflexes. These are, again, note, these are important questions. I would like you to know why we're actually looking at this and why we're devoting time. Well, first of all, we're interested in the general question of what do human infants have from birth? That is not taught, right? We want to know that so that we can understand what is learned, and we can understand the rate at which it's learned. We can also understand what factors affect the learning of it, right? What develops? Another one is perception along with action constitutes the first tools that the infant has to start making meaning of the world. So it is their tool to understand the world, right? Because imagine, again, if you can go back to, you can't go back, but if you can imagine yourself as an infant with no language, but no language meaning you cannot, it's not that you can understand people and you can't talk. You really can't understand, right? Your perceptual abilities are going to be the windows through which you start exploring and understanding the world. And perception will tell us about the beginnings of social and emotional development. And also it gives us clues about infants' cognitive functioning. Remember the habituation experiments where we talked about the rate with which infants habituate and dishabituate? Actually correlate later on with some intelligence measures. And we talked about how it has to do a lot to do with attention. We talked a little bit about long lookers. This was just on Monday. Long lookers versus short lookers. But when I say short lookers, I don't mean fleeting looks. I mean those that scan for a short period of time and get to understand what they're looking at and avert their gaze, short lookers. And we said that the short lookers are at an advantage. So if the child can habituate fast, but then dishabituate fast too, it tells us that this child is flexibly directing their attention to process stimuli. So that is why I said remember the habituation experiments here. Okay, tactile perception. So hands are, for the baby, both a source of knowing and a tool for doing. So we will see next week, we will start talking at length about Piaget, and he will try to tell us how cognitive development happens, how it emerges from a host of reflexes. He's going to give the child very little in terms of innate capacities, but he's going to give the child reflexes and action. And from there on, he's going to build how a child comes to attain knowledge about the world, about objects, numbers later on, about properties of objects, about reasoning, and so on and so forth. And so for him, for example, action will be the first mode of thought for the child. The children will think in action. You know, when they're doing, they're actually thinking. So in this case, that's why this first bullet, I'm going over it. It's not only a way to do things, it's also a way to know things for the infants. So as compared to other sensory abilities, unfortunately, research on infants' tactile perception is fewer, it's scarce. Not because researchers aren't interested in it, but it's also a challenging field because there are the limitations of the baby's own motor development as well, right? Because the babies are very limited in their voluntary movements early on. Regardless, we know that newborns respond to touch on mouth, on palms, on the soles of the feet, and on genitals. Later, they will start exploratory mouthing, which is putting things in their mouth to understand what they are, right? At which point, of course, parents are extremely careful not to leave around stuff that babies can swallow. And pleasurable touch releases endorphins. So stroking a baby's back, for example, and it's not only with babies, it's with other animals too, actually, releases endorphins. They are sensitive to pain even at birth, which means that when babies are circumcised in the hospital, they actually are sensitive to pain. It hurts. And so your book also discussed it a little bit. So we try not to give local anesthesia if it's not necessary to babies, but there's more research going, and now some forms of local anesthesia have been proven to be used for babies in these cases. We know because their crying is different, it is shrill, it is less consolable, and there are ways, of course, to try to soothe the baby. Breast milk is one of them. Sugary substances, we like it, you like it, the babies like it too. You break up with your boyfriend, you go home, you bake a cake. Yes, there's a reason for that. Babies are also attracted to sweet tasting things. And yes, there could be an evolutionary reason for that too. And so it actually eases the pain for them a little bit, giving them sugar, gentle holding, talking to them, your voice actually helps. Okay. What else do we know about what babies know about what they touch? We use a type of habituation paradigms where there's a picture of this in your book too, where babies' hands are separated from their visual field. So they can't see what they're touching. And we try to basically do experiments by giving them different objects and seeing whether they're understanding that the new object is different by the way they're attending to the object. By 6 months, babies can differentiate geometrical shape, so meaning what they're holding in their hand, whether it is curvilinear or rectilinear, meaning whether it has angles or curves, right? So they will understand if you give them something that is square, but take it away and then give them something that is the same texture, the same size, but this time a circle, for example. They understand topological relations, for example, full objects versus an object with a hole inside it, a part missing, for example. And so remember also the way that they are, so we're talking about tactile perception, right? In the 2 previous slides, we talked about motor development. So the way that they can actually hold an object and explore it has a lot to do with the tactile perception too. You know what I mean? So those 2 things, for example, are quite dependent on one another and should not be thought of as independent. Or they understand volumetric objects, 3-dimensional versus 2-dimensional, flat objects versus 3-dimensional objects like a ball, for example. Yes? Well, they can understand that there are two different objects, but not meaningfully enough if they're actually, but it's not meaningful enough. They don't pay as long attention to the difference between the two objects, for example. By 6 months, we are sure that they are actually differentiating between the two. We are still actually just providing them stuff to touch, and we're trying to understand their reaction to what they're touching without the added benefit of the visual input. The paradigm is still quite the same, but we can't really have them sit down and do this stuff, so the arrangement is a little bit more different, but the logic of it is still the same. Newborn sense of taste and smell. Okay, we talked about how you are not the only ones who like brownies, but babies like sweet things too, right? They like sweet taste at birth, and mother's milk is a little bit sweet, actually, yes. How do you know? Do we want to know? Were you curious? Or, yes. So it's much sweeter than normal milk? Okay. Has anybody else tasted? Okay. The front row is full of inquisitive people. Yes, I also know a friend who pumped too much milk and tried to make sütlaç out of the rest. Your friend who has tasted the milk says it would taste delicious. Here in the front row, yes. What?
Can we diagnose them according to DSM-5, like psychopaths?
Why would we? No, there's nothing. It's curiosity. So yes, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, why she pumped that much, I don't know. She did try to get her husband to eat it. Her husband wouldn't. But that is between her and her husband. Yes.
Does the taste differ from one mom to another? No.
What?
How many did you taste that? At least three.
Yes, but it does actually change a little bit according to mother's diet.
Yani ama genel olarak şekerli.
Your friend knows this. So if you have any, I have not tasted mother's breast milk. And so, I mean, not that I can recall at least. So you can ask your questions too. What was your name again? Mina. Huh. Evet. Okay, for some reason I thought you had a different name. İyi ki sormuş. Evet. Okay. We will talk about this during the break. Okay. All right, so, but the thing is, it's not like the baby's taste repertoire stays limited to sweet things. They quickly learn to like the taste of new things too. If it were only sweet, all of our kids would be obese, correct? But no. They have older preferences from birth. It is very much affected by mother's diet during pregnancy. And we're going to look at a simple experiment about that. And they can locate odors, identifying mother by the smell from birth. Yes. 2 hours after birth, babies can differentiate tastes. We know because they produce facial expressions that are very similar to adult expressions in response to sweet stimuli, sour stimuli, and bitter stimuli. So as you can see, yes, babies seem to at least perceive these tastes like we do, giving the same facial expressions that we give. What are cultural and environmental influences on babies' preferences for taste? Their experience shapes food preferences through indirect exposure, both through the amniotic fluid when the baby is in the mother's womb, and also through breast milk later on, and also through experience. For example, if the child is fed a certain baby formula at 4-year-old age, they're going to seek that kind of food that actually tastes similar in certain respects, not the same obviously, to the formula. So our preferences come in from early on. Smell, now infants we know turn their heads preferentially to the smell of maternal breast odors. And they have experimented with this, with putting the baby on the mother's bosom, sometimes washing one of the mother's nipples so that it doesn't smell anymore, but leaving the other scented. And so the babies will turn their head towards the one that is scented, although they could use both to receive milk. They prefer, on general, human milk to formula, but of course if there's no choice given, it's not like the baby has a lot of choice. They're not going to be, no, this is not gourmet enough for me. A lot of babies are being fed on formula. It could be a choice. It could also be that sometimes mothers can't nurse for health reasons. It doesn't happen. Some babies don't have enough sucking power, and so sometimes a mother's milk doesn't come enough to feed the baby, so the mothers mix it with formula, for example. I'm telling you all this because there's also, there is a lot of benefit to mother's milk. We know this. But I feel like there's also a new generation of mothers who are policing one another. Like if a mother isn't nursing, they judge that mother. And I don't think there's any reason to do that either, because they wouldn't know some mothers can't actually nurse. And so I am also trying to instill both a sense of what to do and what not to do, but I would love it if you become less judgmental parents at one point in time, because in my own experience, it seems like women seem to judge one another a little bit more and create this it's already difficult being a mother or a father, and so then this added pressure of what others are going to tell you to be right or wrong is something that makes your life even more difficult. That is, I think, completely unnecessary, if you ask me. So do not become judgmental parents. Do what you think is right. Of course, given that you are taking this class, I hope that you're going to read before you do something novel, right? Reason within limits, and don't judge others because they're doing something different, unless it's hurting the baby. Okay. This very cute study is about mothers in France. And these mothers, so in this region of France, they use a lot of anise to flavor their cooking. Anise, anason. Yes. Bizde de var. These mothers obviously aren't drinking rakı. Let's think of them as eating anasonlu galeta. Yok mu? Very nice, yes. And I won't give names in order not to promote the establishment, but there is a patisserie outside campus that does incredible anasonlu gevrek, because I am so addicted to it. And so anyways, so some mothers did not eat anise, and other mothers did. And these other mothers who did eat anise actually ate quite a bit of anise the last 2 weeks of their pregnancy. And these are these babies who are just born. So this is the day that they were born. They're really, truly newborns. Huh? What is harmful? They're not eating. What they have, this is about odor. So this is Q-tips that they dipped in liquid with anise. Yes, so they're not feeding babies anise at this point in time. They're just making them smell it. Right? And you can see the baby whose mother consumed anise is quite happy smelling it. And the other one finds it a little bit repulsive. It turns his head. You can see it's overall not a happy expression on his face. Yes? Yemiyor işte. No, it's not like, these are not with alcohol either. So if you were thinking poppy seed, for example, you shouldn't think about it as something that is going to induce a sense of euphoria or something. Do you ever get the sense of euphoria out of ana sonlu gevrek? Most likely not, no. Yes. Newborn sense of hearing. Okay. Now, newborns can hear a wide variety of sounds at birth. Even before birth, in the mother's womb, they actually do hear a little. That's why they recognize mother's voice earlier than others. Yes, so fathers are at a disadvantage. Yes, because the baby is going around with the mother and is getting that stimulation, right? They prefer complex sounds like noises or voices to pure sounds like pure sound is that, okay? So they can learn sound patterns within days. They're actually very crafty when it comes to what they hear and what they remember of what they hear. And this is going to help them immensely because they need to learn a language, right? This has to be strong. So they're sensitive to voices and they are, in some ways, biologically prepared to learn a language. They don't come knowing a language. They are prepared. They have the abilities that will help them learn the language fast. For example, they can differentiate between the same word said with different stress on different syllables. Like mama versus mama, you know. So they can actually differentiate these two, although it is the same word. They also understand if the same speaker speaks a different language. Try it if you find a new baby. So go home, you can try it, and for a minute or two, just speak English with your kid to see if the kid is like, what is happening now? Yes? 2 to 4 months, they distinguish changes in tempo. So it's the same rhythm, but the tempo changes. Yes? 4 to 7 months, a sense of musical phrasing, meaning, for example, if there's a melody, if it's cut in the middle, they actually get more irritated than when it's cut between the melodies. 6 to 8 months, they start screening out sounds that are not used in their language, meaning if their language does not have that sound, they become less sensitive to it. It helps. We'll talk about it more in language development. They start recognizing familiar words and their natural phrasing in their native language, right? So if you think about it, if, for example, does anybody know Bulgarian here? Good. My bonus language was Russian. Nobody knew it, but now I'm getting 1 or 2 students who know Russian, so Russian is no longer the token language for examples for me. So if, for example, you're sitting and over headphones, you're listening to news in Bulgarian, it sounds like a constant stream of sounds because you don't know the language. There are, of course, spaces in between words, just like in any other language. But you can't really determine them, right? And it is essential that you parse that stream of sounds into manageable units because that is how you're going to attain those words. You need to understand where they start and when they end. In order to do that, next slide also goes over it, you actually need to recognize the words that are used often, the sounds that come together often within words that you hear with more frequency. It is a statistical probability kind of method that you need to employ. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. Let's look at this last one. 8 to 9 months, they detect syllables that often occur together in the same word. So speech perception in infants, they can detect sounds of any human language. So you're not, for example, a Turkish baby is not biologically prepared to learn Turkish, right? I'm sure nobody was thinking that. You take that Turkish baby to Japan, that baby becomes a native Japanese speaker, right? And that is the beauty of it. And that is also why it would be very inefficient and disadvantageous if we were actually very much born with targeted abilities, right? But this is a general capacity of language learning that these babies have. They prefer their own mother's voice, and the mothers speak in what we call motherese. What is motherese?
Mother language?
Mother language. What is mother language?
Language that your mother speaks.
Language that your mother speaks. But it's not your native language. Motherese is actually, this is kind of a bad naming because we could have named it fatherese too. I'm sure Emre Bey does this as well. When you talk, and you guys do it too, when you talk to a baby, you talk in a special way, right? Smaller words and sentences, repetition, higher pitch, right? So you don't talk to a baby like you're talking to your friend over the phone, for example, right? So I do observe on campus that some boyfriends and girlfriends do talk to one another as if, yes, yeah, I am not alone. I have to say this. The other day, I was standing outside next to a couple. The girl managed to say aşkım about, I am not kidding, 15 times in a minute. Like, it was almost like, you know, stop in telegraphic speech. Like, every sentence she finished with aşkım. And I said, like, what kind of love is this? So this is what your professors are doing when they're outside. It looks like they are not doing it. They're on their phone, but no, they're dropping in conversations. The guy was very happy too, by the way, being called aşkım this many times. Yes. I mean, I was clearly jealous, obviously. The amount of, I mean, I was there 5 minutes. The amount of aşkıms I heard, I don't know if anybody called me aşkım that many times in my whole entire life. Yes, you have a question.
Babies can differentiate between the same speaker talking different languages. Does that mean that they can also differentiate between meaningless and meaningful?
When they differentiate, so they're alerted to something. They understand that something different is happening, but they don't know how it is different. You know what I mean? How the researchers understand. Because of this, where is this statistical learning that they think is happening? So in each language, there are regularities. Think of Turkish. Vowels and consonants alternate, correct? And it's very rare that two consonants follow one another. And they don't do it within the same syllable. Correct? And so the Turkish baby comes to expect this. Doesn't know what a consonant is. Doesn't know what a vowel is, right? That baby will grow up to be a first and second grader. That's when they're going to learn. But can hear the difference. And so they somehow statistically understand. And when I say statistically, obviously they are going to understand statistics when they come to the university, like you guys are doing, taking stats too. But they understand that some of these sounds occur together more often and less often. And so when a new language violates this, so say Russian might have a different rhythm to it, Bulgarian might have a different rhythm to it, different sound rules to it, then the infant is alerted that something different is happening. Okay? All right. Yes. Multisensory communication helps babies associate words with objects. Multisensory meaning it's not just hearing, but it's also seeing, it's also touching, several things happening at once. And this is something that parents know to do, right? For example, you don't take the baby to the window and say, tree. It doesn't work like that, right? You basically point things out. And usually infants, and we're going to see it in the visual perception section too, attention is more often drawn to moving things. right? So if there's a tree and there's a car that's moving, the infant doesn't know either word, probably is going to assume the car is the tree, right? So, I mean, these are kind of common sense to us. We have certain intuitions about these things. And for that reason, we don't try to teach language to babies in kind of passive, still ways, like with flashcards, for example, right? And I have worked with a child who was being taught a language with flashcards, and it was extremely detrimental to that child's normal development. And sometimes it happens that parents want to, this is, when it happens more with, not with low SES parents, but with high SES parents. These parents want to give more than one language to the child, and then they try to teach the second language in unnatural ways to a very young child, like using flashcards with 6-month-olds, and says apple, elephant, And this is not the way through which babies learn language. And it doesn't become functional in that manner either. I am going to say it in the language section too, but let me say it says there is no harm in repeating it. I will tell you that there are two things. Two things, but the list could actually be 3 or 4 too. But 2 things that I actually care a lot about because I see less of it happening at home. 2 things that parents give their children that best schooling cannot later on in life. One is good language. If parents speak rich language at home, they have good vocabulary, they talk about different things, they use complex grammatical formations. And you can't do that, maybe you're thinking, how will I know whether I'm using complex grammatical formations? You don't have to. If you're a reader, if you read without knowing, you do use longer sentences. Okay? If the child is exposed to this, then the child starts even preschool with an advantage. Why? Because someone who has good language is someone who attains knowledge faster. Think of yourselves. You are all second speakers of English, I think. Is there anybody who's a native speaker of English here? Just you, okay. Well, you are not at a disadvantage at this point, but you are, do you know Turkish too? Biraz, okay. So you can maybe relate to it when you think of yourself with Turkish. But think about how much harder it was in your first year when you were reading your textbooks. Because you're not only dealing with new information or complex information, you are also dealing with the challenge that that second language is providing for you, right? And how much faster it is for others whose English might have been better than yours at the time. So it is the same with children too. If they have good language, then they are one step ahead. That's one. The second one, I'll come to. The second one is self-regulation. We will talk about that, I think, at the end of next section. Self-regulation is the ability to control attention. And a lot of significant developments happen during the preschool years. And fathers and mothers and households have a lot to do with it. I'm going to talk about self-regulation when I get there. Yes?
I was just going to comment on the second language education.
Mm-hmm.
I read in a book and I have learned that even if you speak or learn better the second language than your native language, it's actually neurologically impossible to
Replace the...
Yeah.
Yes, that is true. And yes?
I'm not sure again, but I've heard also that if a child is exposed to multiple languages in a house, I mean, even for example, if the father is from Japan and the mother is from France, I don't know, I've heard that they feel less love.
Oh, I have not heard this.
I heard that if a baby hears, like I said, multiple languages, they can internalize one language. Therefore, they feel less belonged or something.
I have
like that.
not I've heard many things about bilingual children, but I haven't heard this. And if you do find where you did read it, I would love to see it too. What we know about bilingual children is that it works best if the natural context actually has that language. So it doesn't work as well when two Turkish parents decide, I'm going to speak English and you speak Turkish. It happens. It happens. I've actually met people who do this. I wouldn't advise it. I wouldn't advise it for many, many reasons. Why wouldn't I advise it? So let me tell you, I mean, I'm pretty proficient in English myself. But I wouldn't try to talk to my child in English. I would, want them to get Turkish first. And this is not a nationalistic agenda on my part. It is because you don't only impart knowledge to your child, you discipline your child. You give love to your child. And the language that is your own is the language in which you have the most creative license, right? You create words. You create expressions. I mean, you call your child, işte mercimeğim, fasulyem, this, that, you know. You speak in ways that may not be grammatical in a way, but it's still grammatical pragmatically. It sounds right, right? And you will have to tell the child, for example, not to do something sternly but lovingly. There's a fine gradation there. Are you proficient enough in that second language to do it? And if you can't then, what are you doing? You are sacrificing your relationship with the child. The cost is to teach the child a language. That child could learn a language. You send them to a good school. I went to a good school. You guys all went to good schools. You know, you are not the only source. I mean, you have, as a parent, you have so many responsibilities. You are not only a language teacher. You do a lot of work with that language. And if you are not proficient in that language, you are not going to be able to do as well of a, or as good of a job as you could, in my point of view. Yes?
I was going to ask, so the problem is that because the parents' native language is not that language that they're trying to teach the child, that's the problem, right? Because my cousin's mother, so my aunt's native language is Russian, but her father's native language is French. So when she speaks to her mother would always respond in Russian, and when the father comes home from work, they talk in French. So she basically was raised bilingual. So basically she knows the difference between two languages, and she can understand Russian, but because she was accustomed to, because she lives in France, obviously, she speaks in French, and she responds in French, but
that's very typical. Yeah, and that's the most natural thing to do. If the two parents have different languages, then those parents should maintain their own language and speak to the child in their own language. At least experts say up till the age of 4 or 5, try not to mix languages. Like, meaning, so let's say I could speak both English and Turkish. I have a kid, and I choose to speak Turkish. Say my husband speaks English. I shouldn't keep going back and forth between English and Turkish when I'm speaking to the child. Obviously, when I'm speaking to my husband, I'm going to speak in English because he doesn't know Turkish. But
that would be funny.
Yes. But with the child, you should not keep mixing, because the child basically sets you as a context and is very comfortable in imposing this language's laws versus that language's laws when they're talking to you. But if you start mixing it up, it becomes quite problematic for the child. Shall we give a break here? Okay.